Thank you and welcome to you all. It's a privilege for me. I'm meeting Professor Khanna for the first time. He teaches business and economics at Harvard. I mean, the fact that his online course has been taken by more than 200 million students is...
No, 1 million students.
Million students. Sorry.
Thank you for promoting me.
Yes.
That's called speed meritocracy.
Yes. So, first, tell us about the book. What is it about? I know that top universities in the US are under pressure for being elitist in some senses of the word. So, what is the thesis of your book? If you can explain to the audience.
So the book, thank you, Seema, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm a big fan of the Jaipur Lit Fest, primarily having attended the one in Jaipur, but it's lovely to see the same spirit of sort of democratization of ideas and books and so on, which is very much in keeping with the idea of trying to make a real meritocracy where everybody has free access to ideas. So I appreciate everybody being here. The book is an edited collection of essays, edited with my colleague Michael Sonny, who is, I guess, one of the world's leading historians of China. And we're an unlikely combination. I'm an applied math person working on economics and entrepreneurship in developing countries, and Michael is a historian in the classical sense of the term. But it's been a wonderful symbiosis of relative strengths. And the book contains 15 essays by philosophers, anthropologists, political scientists, economists, lawyers, even an applied mathematician, thinking about the idea of merit as an organizing principle. How do we decide in society who gets to do what, when, why, and how? Why should Donald Trump be president? That is a real question. Why should I be on this panel talking to you about my book? You know, why should Mr. Gandhi be governor of a state in India, or what have you? How is it that societies can figure out how to make people spend their talents in the way that is best suited to their talents? And this is a preoccupation of societies through times of yore. I mean, one of the lovely discoveries in the book, and this turns out to be the punchline of the book in some sense, is when you think about all the angst, and I hope we can get back to the angst about elite universities and so on, because it's a real pressing issue. When you think about all the angst that I see in the student newspapers at Harvard every day, or we see on the front pages of the New York Times, one gets the feeling of sort of American exceptionalism, that this is a problem that America has stumbled into, and there's something that we need to do something about this. And it's true that we need to do something about it, but it's a problem, it turns out, that's as old as the hills. And the point of the book is to say, as Yogi Berra used to say, it's déjà vu all over again, right? We've seen this movie many times before. In the book, we have some lovely essays by colleagues from different parts of the world, including one that goes back to Mencius and Confucius and Kautilya's Arthashastra, saying that, I mean, of course, the term meritocracy was only coined in Britain, you know, a few decades ago, maybe a century ago. I forget the exact date. Actually, a few decades ago, maybe in the 1950s or so. But the ideas that are being struggled with, you see it in the writings of Mozi and Mencius in 350 BC and 400 BC. You see it again in Qing Dynasty China in the 14th to 17th centuries. You see it in Mughal India all over again. And it's always the same patterns. And that's why the book is titled Making of Meritocracy, because one of the things we came away with, when I say we, I mean the collective we who were involved in this project. There were almost about 100 academics working on this, 15 of whom ultimately contributed the essays that are in there. The sense that we came away with was that meritocracy is always a work in progress. In a sense, it contains the seeds of its own demise. You can interpret that as being a pessimistic message or a hopeful message. I'm an optimist by nature. My glass is always half full. But we can talk more about it. But it's déjà vu all over again.
So tell me, why did you choose India and China? And you also talk about Singapore in the book to some extent. Singapore is an island nation, a very small country, compared to India and China.
Fair enough. So let me talk about China and India first. So I'm obviously Indian. I grew up in India. And about 15 years ago, 20 years more than that, actually, 25 years ago, I thought it would be a good idea to contrast India with China. It's become a bit of a cottage industry in the last 10, 15 years. And people have compared it before, back in the 60s, and even prior to that. Max Weber compared it way back when. But the reason I thought it'd be a good, interesting exercise in contemporary historical terms, if you will, if that's not oxymoronic, is the idea that, look, you had two large, populous, civilizational countries, both subjected to foreign domination for a century or two, entering as modern nation states, entering the world order roughly contemporaneously, 1949 for the People's Republic, 1947 for India, and yet going in very dramatically different directions. Mao on the one side and Pandit Nehru on the other side. And I thought, as social scientists, the funny thing is I'm a social scientist, but I'm trained as a mathematician. But as social scientists, we don't have the luxury of running controlled experiments. We don't have a laboratory. We can't tweak this and that parameter and say what comes out. But this was as close to a
But isn't China
natural
running
experiment.
a controlled experiment? I mean, one could
That's
argue.
a separate point. Let me just conclude this point. What I was trying to say is that you would learn more about India by contrasting it with China. It was sort of as close to a controlled experiment. So that's the beginning of my fascination with China. And then I lived there for a while, learned the language. My kids are fluent in it and so on. So I tried very hard to immerse myself in China and, of course, continue the immersion in India. So that's the short answer of why China and India, because they're appropriate foils for each other in some ways. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Did you want to say something?
No.
Singapore is a whole different story. Yeah. Singapore is actually came about because there was a very accomplished academic in Singapore. There is a very accomplished Bernard Young, who is of Chinese origin. And he participated in the exercises and ended up writing a chapter. And we thought Singapore would be interesting because if you could approach meritocracy mechanistically and say, let's design it, that would be a logical place to look. Because you had Lee Kuan Yew, who sort of constructed Singapore out of whole cloth, in effect. It's relatively simple. It's a small, tiny city-state. And to me, it's sort of almost the canonical example of a constructed meritocracy. You march through, do your exams, move up the ranks, get rewarded for it, get privileges commensurate with how well you do in it. Racial tensions are managed in a multi-ethnic society. But even there, we find exact same problems that you see in the United States and so on. In a nutshell, when I say meritocracy contains the seeds of its own demise, in a nutshell, think of it in this way. Suppose we started tabula rasa, right? We're all on the same level playing field, and there is some objective measure of metric, which is a big if, by the way. But let's say there is. And we go through the process of deciding who is most meritorious. And it turns out that these people are most meritorious, so they get to go to positions of influence. Well, what they do as human beings, and this is what goes back to at least the 4th or 5th century BC that we've been able to see, they immediately stack the decks in favor of their progeny and their tribe and those who are close to them. That's human nature. I had the good fortune of studying in a very elite school in this country after coming from India. So of course I took extra care to make sure that my kids also ended up in an elite school. I don't know anybody who wouldn't naturally go in that direction. So in a sense, I'm in trying to over-promote or over-invest in my children, I'm going against a pure meritocracy in some ways.
So does it mean that it's impossible to have the concept of meritocracy as you might understand it definitionally? To me, it brings to mind, it's like a fancy way of saying, is basically the elites capture the system.
Yeah.
You know, if you come from a wealthy class, upper class, your children go to better schools, their children go to better schools, and it just goes on like that. So how do societies deal with sort of broadening the base?
That's the subject of the entire 15 chapters, to explore this first philosophically, then historically, then in contemporary times, and then there are some, dare I say it, prognostications for the future, sticking your neck out sort of analyses. But again, the title of the book is The Making of Meritocracy, because we don't think that an idealized meritocracy can ever be achieved, for the reasons that the elite will always rig it, or as you put it, perfectly sensible way to put it, the elite capture it. The only thing that we can do, and which has been done, it must be said, very successfully through time and space, time and time again, is contain the extent of elite capture and keep it within manageable limits. That is doable. And the reason we are wrapped up in angst today in my adopted hometown of Cambridge, Massachusetts, we're wrapped up in angst today, well, because arguably elite capture may have gone too far, right? But there are lots of things that can be done by it. And the other thing I'd say is, this is less in the book, but just reflecting on, with the passage of a little bit of time since editing the essays, that there are some societies that are doing a much better job at it even today than before. I mean, we can cite examples, between, I might get the dates wrong if there are any experts on China in here, but roughly 1910 to 1950, the composite of who got to be at the top of Chinese influence changed dramatically. And it was the result of a conscious decision by the power structure saying we don't want elite capture, we want a broadening of talent, we want more talent inclusion. If you will, in contemporary parlance, we want more, what do we call it these days, DEI, diversity, equity, and I forget inclusion, thank you. We want more, the equivalent of DEI, and they went at it, hammer and tongs, and it worked dramatically. Women entered the academy in dramatic numbers in China, including in STEM, where they were underrepresented, except in engineering, right? The spatial distribution of where talent was admitted into the mainstream of Chinese society dramatically jumped up. And I'm trying to think of what else. And yes, the earlier Chinese elite would always come from prior Chinese elite, which is a version of elite capture, in effect. And the new elite, if you will, suddenly came from the professional classes and the middle classes and the lower middle classes. So in 40 years, all of society was rejigged. So we can do it.
So, okay, in China, they broadened the base somewhat. But one could argue that even today, the Communist Party bosses and their kids, the so-called princelings, isn't Xi Jinping's daughter, didn't she go to Harvard?
Now, going to Harvard is not a bad thing.
Okay. Got it.
my president, I mean, we've got a bunch of Harvard alums in here, Ken, you're going to have to defend me if he's a Harvard guy back there. It's not really a bad thing, The question is, can we make it fair so that people have a decent shot at it, right? That's the issue. And I do think it can be made a lot more fair than before. So when you, and the princelings absolutely have had a leg up, there's no question. And the way you get a leg up in any elite structure in any society, whether historical society or contemporary society, is pretty much the same. I mean, if you're part of the elite, you have better access to resources, so you are nurtured much more, you're mollycoddled more, you're pampered more, you have more, all this kind of stuff.
So it basically comes naturally to you to go up the ladder?
To me personally? Or?
No, to the...
To someone who's fortunate, yes. And that's been true again through time and space. By the way, where we are sitting, I think, is one of the great levelers. We're sitting in a public library.
Yes.
I mean, as an Indian immigrant to America, I always used to think, going back to, when I first came here in 1984, I remember thinking, this public library thing is the coolest thing in the world. Now, where I grew up in, Delhi and other places, there were public libraries, but they were, few and far between, and they weren't particularly well managed. But public libraries here and the public highway system are the two greatest inventions of this country. I mean, what could be more, democratizing than anybody can walk in? And that's what I love about the JLF, right? The first time I went to, courtesy of Namita and Sanjoy and others, and Willie, yes. First time I went there, I mean, the coolest thing is you just see all these kids walking in and reading books, and some of them just speak in Hindi, and it's wonderful.
It is.
It's really wonderful. And that's what a public library is. So that's a leveling mechanism, right?
Okay, so
And
here's
we've lost that balance. We've got too many Princetons and Harvards and too little on the public library systems. Yeah.
Right. The question I have is, even among the meritorious, in India, let's say, I know India best because I'm from India.
Sure.
The best and the brightest come to the United States, right? So there is a brain drain, what we call brain drain. So what happens to meritocracy in India then? What about the rest? And in China and India, the rest is like 1 billion people, right?
Yeah, so can I comment on the second part of the comment first and then
Sure.
on the first part? So one of the things that, there have been some brilliant books written about meritocracy, including a couple by my good friends, eminent scholars recently. Michael Sandel wrote a nice book called Tyranny of Merit, for instance, that complains that not only is meritocracy not being achieved, the process of trying to be meritorious is itself a pain in the rear end. And so why bother? The problem with that reasoning is that there's no alternative put forward. Leave that aside for a second. The second part of what you said I think is very important, particularly in a country like India. If you think about, we do have pockets of meritocracy in India, right? We've got elite institutions, the Indian Institutes of Technology, management, medical schools, the administrative service, and they operate as a meritocracy. I mean, you prepare for it. It's still a little bit of a rigged meritocracy because when you look at the, if you will, caste composition of those who are in the IITs, there's a chapter in our book by an anthropologist colleague, Ajanta Subramaniam, who says that the composition of students in the IITs is predominantly hugely upper caste, right? So it's still rigged in a sense, but that said, within those who have access to that competitive process, it's a meritocracy. But if you strip away the pockets where, and I'd be happy to be corrected if anybody has a different view on this, if you strip away the small slivers of India where meritocracy is operating, I think you'd still be left with 95% of the population. So for 95% of the population, I don't think there's any functioning meritocracy at all. And so that's why in our book, I really wanted to open up the conversation. All the books about meritocracy that have been written in the last 15 years are effectively about why is Harvard rigging the system, right? Which is what everybody loves to talk about. And it's an appropriate question to talk about. But really, in the rest of the world, it's kind of angels dancing on the heads of a pin to some extent. The real issue is, why are we not talking about how do we make life fairer for 7 out of the 8 billion people in the world? Or 8 of the 9, so to speak. And it's doable. That's the thing that really ticks me off. It's doable. So.
Could it be because those who make it, then
They don't
they
care.
close the door and pull up the ladder,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. Or even if they don't explicitly do that, de facto that's what happens, is that you're so, the stereotypical you are so wrapped up in your own kids, family, life, profession, et cetera, that you don't have time for this. But that's the role of those of us who are more fortunate, including academics like me, is to say it. And so I'm saying that we don't have a functioning meritocracy in most of India for most people, and that's morally repugnant, among other things, and also, dare I say it, plain stupid, at every level. Right? For the
said.
country. Yeah.
Would you agree if I
Sorry,
were...
just can I say an obvious?
Sure,
I didn't
sure.
interrupt. Just an obvious thing. The reason it's stupid is that you are leaving 90% of the talent underdeployed, right? I think that needs to be said. That India in particular, and I'm a huge cheerleader for India. I'm volunteering. I'm working with everybody all the time. I'm happy to put my shoulder to the wheel, but I also have to speak the truth. And the truth is that we are missing the forest for the trees. The vast majority of talent in not just India, most developing countries around the world. Even in this country, and that's why there's so much anger about the elitism, is that the talent is being under-identified, under-nurtured, misallocated, and there is a cost to society of it.
So I don't know if you're familiar with the case in Virginia. There's a very good public high school there where Asian American students were, coming in large numbers.
Yeah.
So a feeling grew that other deprived sections of society, they weren't getting a fair shake. Because, their parents couldn't afford 3 tutors, for example. So, but the parents of Asian Americans actually got really upset and filed a case. I don't know the status of the cases.
The case is in the Supreme Court right now. I don't know if that's not exactly this one, but there is a case filed against Harvard by a gentleman whose name I forget, who basically filed it on behalf of Asian Americans. So he found Asian American plaintiffs, as I recall, who felt that they had been unfairly treated because the meritocracy, what was supposed to be in their eyes a meritocracy, was rigged against them, right? By the way, when my kids were applying to elite colleges, I told them the chances of you getting are lower because you're Asian American, right? And that's just a fact of life right now. So we can worry about dealing with it later on in the fullness of time, but right now, just put your shoulder to the wheel and figure it out. But there is a case. There is a case that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear on exactly this issue, whether, and I hope we can stay on this for a minute or two, on whether, I'm going to say this inaccurately because I'm not a lawyer, so pardon my imprecision, but whether things like race and other factors can be used as part of the admission decision. And if the court says no, then I think a lot of universities are going to have to rethink the guts of their admission process. But did you want to say? Should I?
So, one thought comes to mind. In India, we had this Mittal Commission and the whole churning took place in India, where large sections of deprived castes and minority groups came
into the system,
and they came into the affirmative action system. So much so that the reservation of seats in universities and government jobs got so high, it led to resentment.
Amongst the others.
Amongst the others. And do you think that sort of goes against the idea of meritocracy?
Yeah, so it's a very important issue. As a preface to commenting on both the Supreme Court case in this country and the Mittal Commission in India, in the book we say that all societies, without exception, from the Mauryas in India, to the Mughals in India, to British India, to the Qing dynasty, to the Song dynasty, to the era of Confucius and Kautilya, all have adopted what we call compensatory discrimination. I think that's a term that Michael and I came up with, but I can't be sure. It's just there somewhere. And it is exactly what it means. That societies agree to discriminate against the privileged to some extent. So therefore, to violate meritocracy today, in the interest of promoting more meritocracy in the future. So basically we say to the upper caste in India, or Mr. Mittal in the Mittal Commission. I remember that time, by the way. There was a lot of riots in the street.
I do too. Yes.
I think I was in college here, but visiting Delhi, it was really quite something quite scary. Anyway, what Mr. Mittal would have said rhetorically would be to the upper caste that, sorry guys, you've had too much of. You think you're meritorious today, but actually what you think is merit is a result of accumulated privilege. Therefore, you've got to take a back seat. We're going to discriminate against you in favor of those who've been left behind in society, because the theory of the case is that a generation from now, society will be better off, since it'll be more even. But you have to deal with it, in effect. That has happened to to some extent to people in Beijing and Shanghai today. They feel that those from the tinier cities are given a leg up in getting into Beida and Tsinghua and Fudan universities, the elites of China. It happens in the IITs now. I don't know what the percentage of seats is that are quote unquote reserved. The last number I saw was maybe 20 to 25% of seats in public sector were reserved for jobs, were reserved for the non-upper caste. But that idea of compensatory discrimination has been true again throughout history. And I'll make one more point about this, at least vis-a-vis the Indian case, and I think also the Chinese case. And this surprised me. I expected that, because think about the logic of this compensatory discrimination. The idea is that, look, we'll take a hit today on efficiency by giving less qualified people a leg up, so that in the future efficiency is better, right? But the few studies that I'm aware of, there's not too many, the few studies I'm aware of that looked at, look, in the Indian case, if you allow a lot of reservations to happen, whether it's a public sector job or something like that, do you see a diminution in performance, right? And the answer seems to be you don't really.
Not really.
Yeah, you don't see a diminution. So in a sense, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can do the compensatory discrimination. You may get the benefit in the future, but meanwhile, your costs are not nearly as high or maybe even non-existent, right? So to be a good academic, I would say that these studies are very iffy studies. They're as good as they could be given the data, and there's really not that many of them, so we don't know. But it's possible. At least opens a possibility that, listen, engaging in short-run departures from meritocracy today may not be as expensive as we thought it would be. So we ought to consider it a bit more. But the short answer to the comment, I'm sorry I made a long response. The short answer to the comment is that deja vu all over again. We've seen this movie about 1 million times, even though we rightly get all wrapped up in angst. And what is it? My daughter just graduated from college, so 4 years ago, when she was first kind of applying, I was all up in arms in my head anyway, saying, oh, this is unfair. It's really discriminating against us in some ways. And it's true, but that's part of the societal dynamic and societal bargain that you sign up for when you live in society. So,
would it be correct to say that a controlled society, let's say Chinese society, it has a certain system, autocratic system, is better able to promote meritocracy? I mean, I would think logically it could, compared to India, where people will rise up in arms just about everything. Same in the US. Open societies are more difficult in some senses.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, yeah. I guess that would just be a particular instance of the famous Churchillian statement, right? Which is that democracy is not a great form of government. It's the worst form of government, except everything else.
Yes.
And by the way, that's true of meritocracy too, right? Meritocracy is the worst form of organizing thing, except everything else. So yes is the short answer. That if the Chinese decided that everybody was going to go into colleges only on the basis of this algorithm, and that's how it was, then generally society would comply. But I think the bigger reason that China actually has been a lot more, if I can make a broad kind of very non-mathematical, imprecise statement, if I'm allowed to make, it goes against my grain, but let me make it. The reason I think China has generally been more meritocratic in the whole than has India is very different from what you would think. It is basically that they have ensured that the quality of their primary education is very high, period. Indian primary education is not good, right?
Yeah.
We know that
for this, we can blame Nehru.
Well, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. Yeah. That's a rabbit hole. I'm not going down that rabbit hole.
That was an inside joke, but...
Particularly for, a Jaipur lit crowd, that would be a rabbit hole I don't want to go down.
That's why I made it.
No, thanks. I'm too smart to go down that hole. No, but
Okay.
what I was going to say is that, the primary education in India is terrible.
It is.
You know that from, Pratham's Asar reports. For those of you who
Yes.
don't know, Pratham is a countrywide nonprofit that is really spectacular. It does a lot of work on primary education, and it produces a very analytic report, which sounds like a Hindi word, Asar report. It's annual state of education research or something like that. And it's become like the go-to for how schools are doing. And I don't think our schools are improving at all. If anything, they're getting worse. So when you don't have, and the reason that is the biggest promoter of meritocracy is that unless you can, speak, read, write, count, speak English in particular, read, write English, you can't participate in a meritocracy after that, right? So then you're, de facto excluded, regardless of what the laws are and Mandal commissions and whatever new commissions.
Wait long enough, there'll be a Mandarin meritocracy. English will not work after a point.
I'm prepared. I don't know about you. Yeah. See, but this is how the elite stack their deck, right? Which is, my kids are prepared, I'm prepared, I have businesses in China, so we're all set.
So one of my very good friends and neighbors, George Perkovich, who's a nuclear expert, he lives in the next street. So one day I was just bemoaning to him that, why the US is not taking a stronger stand vis-a-vis China.
Oh, China.
He said, Seema, give up. Start learning Mandarin. I said, okay.
I don't actually subscribe to that. But again, that's a different rabbit hole, Seema. We don't want to go down.
I know we don't want to. Okay. I have a question, completely different tack. How do you improve the process I know you talked about primary education. That's absolutely the must. But in America, you've lived here long enough. How can the US improve its system and make it more meritocratic so it's not elite capture?
I mean, a lot of the answers we know. It's strengthening this public library system,
public school system,
strengthening the public universities, which historically this country has done beautifully, by the way, right? My colleague Raj Chetty, who is one of the leading economists of this generation, has just really shown with very large sample data, brilliantly shown that, and he's not the first, but it's probably one of the most rigorous studies, shown that this idea that in the US today, your zip code is the best predictor of your life, right, has become more and more true. In other words, there's really no social mobility. If you're born rich and well off, and in this country, if you're living in a rich place, your public schools are better funded because they're funded by local taxes, right? So there's so many self-reinforcing mechanisms that if you go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s in this country, you saw enormous social mobility. And now you don't see that social mobility in the US. Arguably, you see it less than in many other places. So we need to get back to a situation where that's possible. Raj's work, which is not really in the book, but I'll just mention it. There's a very famous study that was covered in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago that said that the only way to break out of the zip code lock these days is to have more mixing of people. So in other words, if you are in a poor neighborhood and you happen to have a few kids that you were playing with who are from a richer neighborhood, the odds of your breaking out of your cycle of relative deprivation are dramatically higher, which has a prescription embedded in it, which is find ways to mix people. Easier said than done, but find ways to mix people. And I think, in a sense, by the way, a lot of the elite universities, mine included and my undergrad alma mater, Princeton included, are trying really hard to do this. I mean, they're trying to give out just enormous amounts of financial aid.
So that's two strikes against you, Princeton and Harvard.
I know. I'm looking at Ken to bail me out. Yeah, no, it is two strikes against me. But I mean, I think these universities are doing what they're doing, but they are not really the source of the problem. The source of the problem is much broader. It's much more systemic. I mean, I think there is a role for the elite university to be an example, right? And to be something that people should aspire to, as long as the process of aspiration is freely accessible to all, in theory. And that's where the problem is. If you had the great public schools and kids from the great public school could get to Princeton and Harvard, it's all fine. I don't think people would be upset. I genuinely don't think people would be upset if they thought that they had a shot at it. But they don't have a shot at it now. It's gotten to that point. So I think that's part of the answer. By the way, there are a lot of other answers that are not anywhere in the book. But if you think about the US has estate taxes. The whole idea of estate taxes was to re-level the playing field, right? Basically, grab a chunk from the extra rich and redistribute it through funding into schools and libraries or roads. That has become, again, I'm not an estate tax person, but that has become compromised in its practical efficacy. India, by the way, has nothing like it. We're all in favor of continuing to entrench. In India, the riches just stay rich. So that's a problem. We should have something like that. In China, you've seen really a redistribution happening now, but it's not motivated by promotion of meritocracy. It's just promoted by the Communist Party being upset that big tech in China has become, in effect, too big for its britches.
And become bigger than the party, and the party wants to control that.
Much bigger than the party. And so they've gotten slapped down, and they've gotten the message, and they've gone back into their shells for a little while. So there are mechanisms to ensure this, and I go back to the study which is in our book that our colleagues from Caltech and Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and other places wrote this beautiful study, essentially saying there are lots of examples where it's possible to change the structure of society in relatively short periods of time. We're talking about a generation or two at most. So it's not that long. You can rewire it.
So someone sent me a question. This is not mine. Merit is usually measured by productivity and efficiency. Do you think intellectual and emotional fulfillment has a space in meritocracy?
So in the book, we dance around the question of what is merit in the first. So this book is the result of about 5-6 years of joint work from literally several dozens of people, maybe 100 or so academics in different countries in China, primarily local academics in China and India, and then some in the US and UK. And we came up with this idea that this is something that has been, again, litigated by academics and policymakers from times immemorial. Should this be in the merit function? Should that be in the merit function? Should we value this? Should we value that? We don't have anything to say about it. Instead, what we said was that regardless of whatever is the operative definition of merit in a particular society, whatever society values, and it stands to reason that what you would value would vary dramatically depending on, let's say, the kinds of occupations in your society, right? So, being good at horsemanship and swordsmanship must have been really an important part of merit at some point, but these days it doesn't count for anything. So whatever it is, the principles and observations about the making of meritocracy are somewhat independent of how you define merit. So that's not an answer to the question, but it's basically saying that you can have any conception of merit, and what I've said thus far would hold true. But there is another sense in which what the person who submitted the question is, it's important because the books that have been written recently and heavily reviewed, including my colleague Sandel's, who's the other guy? There's a guy at Yale, Markowitz and Sandel, who wrote these books about the meritocracy trap or the tyranny of meritocracy and so on. They talk about how trying to be meritorious in this country, in the United States, they're talking about the United States, in this country has become so painful. Induces stress. You see, kids' consumption of medications going up, mental health, even pre-COVID, mental health disorders rising quite dramatically in the last 10 years. And so just the act, and they're equating that, or they're positing that the cause of that is the rat race of meritocracy. I don't know that I agree with that, but let's just say that...
I'd buy that.
Let's just say that there's some truth to it. Then that's a sense in which it's a response to the question. It's right to focus on these things because if you are going to make meritocracy, then you don't want to make it in a way that promotes mental you want to do it in a way that promotes mental well-being, right? So.
Right. So let's open the floor for questions. There's a hand up at the back. There's a hand up on the right-hand side.
Somebody passes, yeah.
Do
I'm
they
not sure
have
how
to
this
wait
works.
for the microphone? Or
You have a mic, right? So you want to give the mic to people, or you?
Somebody has the mic.
Okay. Okay. In the meantime, I can.
Yeah.
oh, you already have the mic.
Okay. Go ahead.
Liaquat ji, Tarun ji, thank you very much. That's a good lesson and good conversation. My observation goes to the point we mentioned about brain drain. And I feel that maybe, we have Gopal Krishnan ji also among us, that this might have been a true statement 35, 30 years ago, but maybe not today. Do you agree on that or not? Because we see by the very fact that we are sitting under the JLF umbrella in Boulder here, that itself proves that that statement is no more correct. Do you agree or not? I just wanted to.
I can respond to it with facts. It is true that, so your statement I think is more true about China than it is about India. That in fact, the proportion of students coming out of China and going to universities, particularly universities, we're talking about universities around the world, has declined in recent times. Partly because opportunities have been abundant in China, in pre-COVID China anyway. We are at this interregnum. We don't know what's going to happen in China going forward, but leave that aside for a second. But for sure, a lot more people have gone back to China to build their careers there. A lot fewer people are leaving to study, etc. I think it's less true in India. It is true to some extent, but not so much. It's still the case that a vast majority of people are leaving. Some are going back to build companies. I'm an entrepreneur also. I started a lot of companies in Bangalore. And it's surrounded by people who are from the so-called elite universities here who are building companies there, Indian and non-Indian, which I think is fabulous. It's a mix of populations, mix of opportunities. It's all wonderful. But it's not as big as you think, as your question seemed to think, or Seema's question seemed to think implied. That's what the data say.
no, I never implied that people are going back.
Okay,
my thing was too
you were
many
saying
people are coming here.
I see.
We
okay,
are losing
yeah. Sorry,
their
I
brains.
misunderstood.
Yeah. That the original brain drain.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question.
Yeah, hello. I guess there are many ways to look at the question of meritocracy. And one would be, does the ordinary person have a good shot at some nice position? And we say, is it rigged against this person or not? But there's another issue that interests me, which is assuming there is a meritocracy. And I spent 15 years in Singapore teaching there, so I'm very skeptical even of the Singapore notion of meritocracy. Mm-hmm. But it's assuming we have a meritocracy. Would we want to moderate that idea if the gap between those who have succeeded, if the CEO makes 35 million, the worker makes 30,000, right, in a meritocratic system? The places that talk most about social justice are university. You have professors who are paid hugely, and you have adjunct professors. The very place that talks about meritocracy and social justice, these things are absent. To what extent should we focus on these gaps? And if the gaps were less, would our obsession with meritocracy be lessened?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's a very, very sensible question. And in support of the underlying sentiment, I would say, you have a test case in Scandinavian countries. The discrepancy between the top levels, or in continental Europe, the discrepancy between the top levels of CEOs and the lowest worker, so to speak, in the hierarchy is not nearly as extreme. And arguably, you have less social angst about meritocracy to some extent. But so my spirit is to agree with you, but I'm an academic and I insist on rigor, so let me push back at you, just for the heck of it. So what you would lose something though. What you would lose is the incredible drive that comes from the prospect of big prize, right? If you know, right?
Meaning $5 million as opposed to
50 million.
$3.5 million?
No. Meaning
Okay.
5 million versus 50 million. Okay? I mean, really, those are the numbers you're talking about, right? And the question is, do I think it's a good idea to have that much discrepancy between the wages? Absolutely not. I don't think it's a good idea. I'm with you in spirit. I'm just saying, but you have to address the other side also, which is to say that there's an incentive effect of, like, the reason people want to move up to meritocracy is that they think that they will be better off if they get to the top. And if the prize is bigger at the top, then they will work harder at being meritorious in some ways. Maybe not. Maybe not. That's the flip side. That's the argument I'm saying, right? So if you want to be rigorous about it, you have to address both sides of the argument. That's all I'm saying. But in spirit, I agree with you. And I think that is one of the things that's gone completely out of whack in this country, is that now you've got, $50,000 at the low end to $50 million at the high end in the same company. That just seems unacceptable at every level. And then, of course, it creates all the spillover problems, which is the place where the 50 million person is living, those schools are really fabulous, right? At the place the other one's living, those schools are terrible. And that means the next generation is exacerbated. So I agree that there needs to be a way to, and again, there have been ways to do it, which is in the past, even in this country, we have recycled money into public goods, and now we're not doing it as well, right?
So
or we're letting elite capture run away with it. Yeah.
I want to tell a small, brief story. So 2 weeks ago, a friend of mine who teaches at Georgetown, a professor, tenured professor, told me a really hair-raising story. The professor was trying to fight in her academic committee to raise the wages of the janitor who, cleans the place and their wages are really low.
Sure.
Not one professor supported her campaign. The head of the department came to her later and said, well, in spirit, I'm with you, but nobody supported that. I was just shocked. This is the academy. This is the, forget the private sector and things. These are professors who teach social justice during the day. Anyway, enough said.
That's good. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, we can.
My name is Mahabub. I live in Boulder, and my first sort of two-part question. As you said that in the earlier chapters of your book, you tried to define meritocracy. How did you define that, and how do you measure?
I said I didn't define it.
You did not.
No.
So
I said that the arguments in the book are agnostic to the definition of meritocracy, which is whichever way you define it, the making of meritocracy is always going to be subject to the same forces. It's a very powerful point.
Okay.
It's a very powerful point. It's saying that it doesn't matter whether Qing dynasty, China, and British India defined meritocracy very differently, that you still had the process of elite capture, right? And you still had people trying to clamber up, and you still had people trying to do compensatory discrimination. And so it was always a work in progress. Yeah.
Okay, so my thought was that the notion that meritocracy is something, there is something wrong with it, but is it a sort of an ethical question that it is wrong, or for the very practical reason that if we address that problem, no matter how we define
I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying the opposite. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that I actually don't know a better way. I'm saying meritocracy is fine, and everybody aspires to be in a genuinely fair meritocratic society. It's just that doesn't seem to be possible to actually get to the idealized state of a pure meritocracy. But it seems to me that it's a good idea to keep trying. Because if you don't try, then it gets more and more rigged and stacked, which is what's happening in this country, right?
I have microphone here.
Okay.
Does meritocracy play after the education? Examples, you come out of IITs, you come out of Harvards, now you are working for McKinsey's and Bain's of the world, and how does meritocracy work there?
Sorry, I don't think I understand the question. Are you saying is meritocracy, in general in the private sector, in India, in China, and in the US, you have much more of an approximation of meritocracy? Is that the question? I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I didn't understand the question.
How does that work? So they have metrics for what they define as success.
Sure, yeah.
And so, but what they learn as you go through, after supposedly achieving the success of going to IITs and going, but then there is a lot more to it, isn't it? The meritocracy.
Course, yeah. I mean, going to an IIT or a Peking University, Beida, or a Ivy League university here is nobody's saying it's a guarantee of long-run success, right? Which I think is your point. It's just saying that you probably get a leg up as you start the next rung of engagement with society. There are plenty of my classmates are not successes, right? That's normal. That's part of the process. Yeah.
There was a question here and then here. Okay, 5 minutes. So please make it quick and make it a question, not a comment.
Should we just take a bunch of comments?
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much.
It's fine, you can hear.
Yeah. Last 9 years, because of the Chinese new Silk Road strategy, which is called Belt and Road, it proved that China already changed its institutional, traditional, meritocratical system. They developed a lot. And India also has, maybe we can call Spice Road strategy, Mausim strategy. So from this perspective, I would like to ask, how much as Indian leaders and academicians are serious about getting ready for the Indian rising from meritocratical perspective? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take all the questions together, and please, so can you give the mic to this gentleman in the front row?
Yeah, you said you were looking for mechanisms. So over a century ago, about half the states to address the elite capture of politics instituted direct democracy so that ideas could come up from the bottom as well as the top. But unfortunately, it cost millions of dollars to collect the signatures to get your proposal on the ballot. So this is just a comment. Here in Boulder, by a fluke, we have the first online petitioning in the country, or possibly the world. And that should help level the playing field.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. And can you give the microphone to this gentleman in the front, please? Thank you.
I can have that discussion later on also. I haven't read the book yet, but my question or thinking is, independent of how you define meritocracy or whatever, but can you change it gradually, or does it require a revolution in the system, like a step function? I mean, is it even possible to change it gradually, because human beings they are the worst enemy?
Yeah, I mean, just on going this way, well, his wasn't a question, but I think in the book, we discuss a number of instances of the successful making of meritocracy, and most of them are very gradual. So I can't think of any step function type change. No, not really. Even they're kicked in gradually. The intent may have been, sudden, but the actual manifestation of it is generally gradual. Yeah. And to this gentleman's point, is the Indian state readying itself for the supposed rise of India? That's a complicated question. Yes and no. I said yes in some dimensions, and again, I'm the biggest cheerleader for that. But no in many serious dimensions. I mean, for instance, I just addressed some council connected to the Prime Minister in India last month, and I was very critical, saying that you're very bullish on. So India likes to say that it's one of the big startup capitals of the world now, after the U.S. and China, maybe Israel. But actually, if you look at it in the area of science, cutting edge science, not only is India not keeping up, it's falling further behind, in my view. So there are plenty of places where they're not getting ready. We Indians are not getting ready, and we should. But the first step to getting ready is to point it out and call a spade, which is what I'm doing. So.
And India does everything the Indian way, which is slow and steady. That's why we're the elephant, right?
Thank
Anyway,
you
I think
so much.
we've run out of time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you, Tarun. Thank you, Sana.